Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It is September 1939, and Europe trembles at the edge of catastrophe. In Warsaw, Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, commander-in-chief of the Polish army, gathers his staff in a room lit more by nervous energy than by lamps. Maps are spread across the table, arrows hastily drawn in pencil, but already the Wehrmacht advances faster than the lines can be redrawn. Armored columns grind forward, Luftwaffe bombers howl overhead, and the young Polish Republic is being swallowed in a storm of steel and fire. Despite the grim reports, cities bombed, units encircled, Rydz-Śmigły's words to his officers are steady, almost stubborn. They need only endure, he insists, until France and Britain fulfill their promises. Once the mighty Western Allies march into Germany, the Reich will be trapped between hammer and anvil. Poland's duty is to hold, to bleed, until relief arrives. His staff nod in silence, clinging to that fragile thread of hope. Yet beneath the surface lies a harsher truth. Poland stands alone, its borders vulnerable to two predatory giants. To the west, Germany has long plotted revenge for Versailles. To the east, Stalin eyes the lands once held by the Tsars. For 2 decades, Poland has relied on alliances, treaties, and Western assurances that now feel suddenly abstract. The promises of distant powers are tested against the reality of tanks on their soil. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler exults. His gamble is paying off. Blitzkrieg works. Villages and towns crumble before mechanized columns, cavalry charges are crushed by armor, and propaganda films already trumpet Germany's rebirth. To the world, the invasion is both a warning and a demonstration of what modern war can achieve. In the countryside, the reality is apocalypse. Refugees choke the roads, carts piled with belongings dragged by weary families. Farmers dig trenches in their own fields. Rumors fly. France has invaded. Britain has bombed the Ruhr. Salvation is imminent. For many Poles, rumor becomes prayer, the only shield against despair. But as Warsaw braces itself for siege, the silence from the west grows louder than the guns. France and Britain have pledged their word, yet words alone do not stop advancing armies. The clock ticks, and every day lost brings Poland closer to collapse. The curtain has risen on a war that will consume the world. And in its opening act, one question hangs heavy over the battlefield. Will the Allies strike in time, or will Poland be left to face annihilation alone? The treaties had been clear enough. France and Britain swore that if Germany struck Poland, they would answer with force. For Warsaw, those signatures were lifelines, the insurance that the young republic would not stand alone against the Reich. Yet when German troops poured across the border on September 1st, those promises began to unravel in practice. In Paris, Prime Minister Édouard Daladier and Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet received news of the invasion with alarm, but not with action. The Polish ambassador Juliusz Łukasiewicz pleaded for immediate measures, but Bonnet could only offer bureaucratic delay. France could not declare war, he explained, without the formal vote of a legislature still scattered on summer holiday. As German tanks advanced, French deputies boarded trains from the countryside, summoned not by conscience, but by constitutional procedure. This was not indifference alone. It was the scar tissue of 1914. France had buried nearly a generation in the mud of Verdun and the Somme. That trauma haunted every debate, every cabinet meeting. To rush forward again into a continental war felt like national suicide. And so an abundance of caution that bordered on inaction prevailed, masking fear as prudence. Hitler understood this better than anyone. He had studied his enemies and knew the cracks in their resolve. France had built walls of concrete along the Maginot Line, fortresses that symbolized security, but also a deep defensive mindset. Britain had clung to diplomacy, hoping appeasement might keep the storm at bay. Now, as Poland burned, both powers hesitated, each waiting for the other to leap first. In Warsaw, the gap between words and deeds widened into despair. Officers counted the days until the promised French offensive, convinced relief must already be underway. Priests reassured parishioners that France had crossed the Rhine. Families huddled in basements prayed to hear Allied artillery thunder in the west. But only silence came. The pattern was tragically familiar. For centuries, Poland had been betrayed by the shifting interests of great powers, carved apart by those who once vowed friendship. Now in 1939, history repeated itself. France and Britain had pledged steel, but delivered only delay. And in Berlin, Nazi officials read the West's strategic inertia as confirmation of Hitler's gamble. If France and Britain wavered now, at the very moment their honor was tested, why should he ever fear them later? Each day of delay was a gift to the Reich, and Hitler seized it with both hands. The morning after the invasion, Paris seemed almost indifferent. Markets bustled, cafes served their regular patrons, and newspapers sold briskly with headlines screaming of war. Yet behind the doors of government, confusion reigned. France had pledged itself to Poland, but the machinery of its republic was sluggish, bound by rules and rituals that moved at the pace of committees, not armies. Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet received the Polish ambassador Juliusz Łukasiewicz on September the 1st. His plea was urgent. Germany was tearing Poland apart. France must act. But Bonnet could only reply with a grim explanation. The French Constitution forbade declarations of war without legislative approval. The deputies, still dispersed on their August holidays, had to reconvene first. In Warsaw, Polish soldiers were dying by the hour. In Paris, politicians were boarding trains back from the countryside. Daladier himself was torn. Haunted by the ghosts of Verdun, he faced generals who urged caution, politicians who feared collapse, and a public bracing for the inevitable. Even as cables arrived describing the bombardment of Polish cities, the French state moved with a strategic inertia that betrayed its paralysis of will. Then came Mussolini's meddling. Eager to cast himself as Europe's broker, the Italian dictator proposed a peace conference to settle the Polish crisis by negotiation. It was theater more than policy, but Bonnet echoed the idea, giving French hesitation a diplomatic cover. In London, the suggestion enraged Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax. The British no longer believed in Hitler's promises. For them, delay meant complicity in Poland's destruction. Within the French High Command, General Maurice Gamelin watched the government's faltering response with unease. His diary captured the mood. The British were pressing for immediate hostilities, fearing that France might shrink from action at the last moment. Yet Gamelin and his staff still argued for time. Time to evacuate civilians along the German frontier, time to organize defenses, time to prepare for a war they dreaded would mirror 1914. By September 2nd, Paris sat in limbo. Diplomats exchanged furious telegrams. The Luftwaffe reduced Polish neighborhoods to rubble. German tanks drove deeper east. And in France, a nation sworn to act remained bound by fear, law, and memory. On the boulevards, Parisians whispered and speculated. Would France declare war within hours? Or would this crisis, like Munich a year earlier, fade into another hollow compromise? For Warsaw, such speculation was cruel. For France, it was a symptom of leadership shackled by the ghosts of the past, unable to match deeds to words. Across the Channel, London's patience was running out. To the British, the invasion of Poland was more than a distant crisis. It was the final test of their credibility. Neville Chamberlain, whose return from Munich a year earlier with peace for our time had already curdled into shame, now faced the collapse of his policy. If Britain failed to act, it would not only doom Poland but destroy the very trust of Europe in British promises. On September the 2nd, Chamberlain and Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax pressed Paris relentlessly. Britain had pledged support to Poland, and inaction would make that pledge a lie. They urged France to strike decisively, to mobilize fully, to match the words of alliance with deeds of war. Each cable carried the same urgent demand. Do not falter now. General Gamelin noted the tension with bitterness in his diary. The British, he observed, feared that France would shrink from its duty at the last moment, that their allies' will to act was already cracking. Britain was scarcely ready for a continental campaign itself, but it understood that the moment required resolve, not delay. In Paris, however, leaders clung to an abundance of caution that bordered on inaction. Gamelin and his staff argued for more time to evacuate civilians along the frontier, time to arrange deployments, time to ensure France would not stand alone under German fire. To them, prudence was strategy. To Warsaw, prudence was abandonment. On the streets of London, public opinion grew louder by the hour. Crowds gathered outside Downing Street, demanding a stand against Hitler. The illusions of appeasement had evaporated. There was no appetite for another Munich. Chamberlain, heavy-voiced and weary, told Parliament that Hitler's word was worthless. Britain, he declared, must act, or it would cease to matter in Europe at all. And so, while London steeled itself, Paris still drifted. Britain's urgency became Poland's last hope. France's strategic inertia, by contrast, was Hitler's greatest ally. In those hours of decision, the fate of nations balanced on whether Paris would move or whether it would let the moment slip into silence. While politicians stalled, the French people themselves responded with a clarity their leaders lacked. The mobilization order summoned more than 4.5 million men, and they answered. Train stations filled with reservists in mismatched coats, carrying satchels or bundles of belongings, kissing wives and children goodbye before boarding crowded carriages. Platforms echoed with songs, some light, others solemn, as bands played martial tunes. Posters on the walls urged duty and sacrifice. Despite the caution at the top, ordinary citizens carried a sense of grim resolve. The scars of 1914 were still raw, yet there was also resentment at Hitler's endless provocations. Austria, Czechoslovakia, now Poland. Il faut en finir, people said over coffee or wine. Enough is enough. If war had come, then war must be finished. Inside the barracks, spirits were unexpectedly high. Soldiers wrote home with confidence, eager to prove themselves. Many had grown up hearing their fathers speak of Verdun and the Marne. Now it was their turn to defend France. They believed the Allies would move swiftly, that Germany would be checked before its momentum grew. For a moment, it seemed as though unity had returned to a nation often fractured by politics. But beneath that determination, other voices stirred. Fascist sympathizers, though a minority, warned that war against Hitler was folly, that Bolshevism posed the real threat, not Germany. Others, haunted by the memory of the last war, quietly dreaded that this mobilization meant another generation would be sacrificed in the trenches. On the home front, families prepared for air raids that never came. Cities imposed blackouts, turning Paris into a shadowed husk at night. Children practiced drills in schools, ducking under desks or filing into cellars. Housewives stocked pantries. Neighbors dug shelters. Priests reassured congregations that France was strong. It was a society bracing itself for catastrophe even before the first bomb fell. The irony was stark. The people were prepared for struggle, ready to bear hardship, but their government remained uncertain, caught in cycles of procedure and fear. While civilians accepted the inevitability of war, their leaders wavered, clinging to caution that paralyzed decision-making. The nation's spirit and its strategy were already drifting apart. On September 3, 1939, the moment of decision finally arrived. In London that morning, the British government delivered its ultimatum. If Germany did not withdraw from Poland, war would follow. The deadline passed unanswered. At 11:15 a.m., Neville Chamberlain's voice came across the radios of Britain, solemn, heavy, stripped of hope. The country was once again at war with Germany. Crowds gathered in silence, many in tears, aware that the world had stepped back into darkness. Hours later, in Paris, Ambassador Robert Coulondre carried the French ultimatum to Berlin. At 5 o'clock that evening, France too was at war. The announcement rang through the capital with church bells and extra editions of newspapers. Some greeted the news with grim relief. At last, France was standing firm. Others felt only dread, as though the sacrifices of 1914 had come to claim a second generation. On the streets, reservists left for their units as families clung to one another on train platforms. Women wept openly. Men swallowed their fear beneath stiff salutes. The air was thick with the sense that history was repeating itself, that Verdun and the Marne would be relived in new battles yet to come. And yet, for all the gravity of the declarations, the Western Front remained strangely still. In the weeks that followed, few shots were exchanged. Soldiers manned their positions, civilians endured blackouts, and rumors filled the silence. To later generations, this interval became the Sitzkrieg or phony war, as if nothing at all had happened. But to those living it, there was nothing phony about the fear, the mobilization, the sudden reality of families divided and futures uncertain. Within the French High Command, the declarations were less a rallying cry than a question mark. Now that war had begun, what next? To strike boldly into Germany might invite devastation in return. To remain defensive would betray Poland. The choice weighed heavily on Daladier and his generals, already wary of repeating 1914's horrors. For the Allies, the war had begun in solemnity rather than triumph. But beneath the surface of resolve lay the same weakness, a paralysis of will, a reluctance to transform declarations into decisive action. The world was at war, but war itself seemed not yet to have begun. To many, the autumn of 1939 would later be remembered as strangely still. Historians called it the drôle de guerre, the strange war, or more damningly, the phony war. The image lingered of millions of soldiers staring across empty battlefields, waiting for a fight that never came. Yet this memory is deceptive. Europe was already burning, and Poland was already bleeding to death. By September 6th, Krakow had fallen. German panzers sliced through defenses. Luftwaffe bombs reduced neighborhoods to rubble, and refugees clogged every road. Warsaw braced for siege as civilians dug trenches in their parks. Every day lost in the West meant another day of agony in the East. General Maurice Gamelin knew it. Months earlier, he had promised Polish officers that a German invasion would trigger a French strike within 2 weeks. "The cavalry will come," he assured them. But in private, speaking to his British counterparts, he revealed a very different intention. He had no desire to throw France into another Verdun. The Maginot Line embodied this philosophy, a fortress meant to endure, not a springboard to attack. Thus, when the moment came, Gamelin and his staff fell into a paralysis of will, studying maps instead of seizing opportunity. Still, France could not remain entirely idle. Mobilization brought men to the frontier, artillery was positioned, engineers cleared paths, and patrols edged cautiously across no man's land. The army was not motionless. It was preparing, inching forward, but always with a leash around its neck. In Warsaw, radio broadcasts begged for news of French action. Had the Allies attacked? Were German divisions being pulled back from Poland? Rumors fed hope, columns advancing into the Rhineland, French banners flying in German villages. In truth, the reality was far more limited. Small moves, deliberate and slow, a gesture rather than a blow. The phony war was never phony for Poland. Each day of Western delay deepened the noose around its neck. For France, it was a demonstration of strategic inertia, a nation that declared war but struggled to wage it. The Saar Offensive was approaching, but it would be marked not by audacity, but by the heavy caution of leaders unwilling to risk too much, too soon. On the night of September 7th, 1939, France finally moved. 11 divisions advanced into Germany along a 15-mile front near Saarbrücken. It was not the sweeping offensive Poland had imagined, but it was something. The first Allied boots crossing into Hitler's Reich. Soldiers marched through darkness, boots crunching across fields seeded with mines, rifles clenched tight, nerves stretched taut. The land they entered bore little resemblance to the heartland of a great power. The Saar was industrial, coal pits, smokestacks, rail yards, yet eerily silent. German authorities had evacuated civilians weeks earlier. Villages were abandoned, shutters drawn, doors locked, streets deserted. French troops passed through ghost towns, the only sounds their own movements and the occasional rumble of distant artillery. At first, resistance was almost non-existent. The Wehrmacht's elite divisions were still far away in Poland, leaving behind a skeleton force of reservists and engineers. Instead, the land itself fought the French. Fields mined, bridges rigged with explosives, roads scattered with traps. Casualties came less from battle than from the hidden teeth of German defenses. Yet for the men on the ground, the crossing carried weight. They were stepping onto German soil for the first time since 1918. Some carved their names into abandoned houses. Others pocketed German road signs as trophies. Letters home spoke of pride, but also of unease. This was not triumph, but a crawl through shadows. By September 9th, reinforcements joined and the advance deepened. Still, orders from above insisted on caution. Progress was measured in yards, every hedge cleared, every mine lifted, every move double-checked. It felt less like conquest than inspection. To Poland, it was proof that France had kept its word. To the soldiers, it was action at last. But to history, it was the start of an offensive shackled before it began. The Saar Offensive had commenced, yet already it bore the marks of an abundance of caution that bordered on inaction. What came next would decide whether this step was a true strike or merely a gesture soon erased. For the French soldiers who crossed into Germany, the advance felt less like a new beginning than a grim return. The mud, the rain, the endless waiting under shell fire, all of it summoned the specter of Verdun. The Saar front looked and sounded like the Western Front of 1916, only smaller and emptier. Corporal Armand Petitjean captured the misery in a letter home. He described crouching inside a water pipe, 80 centimeters below ground, with water rising to his knees. For 3 days, he and his comrades huddled there, mortar fire bursting above them. "If the ceiling collapses," he wrote, "we are finished, buried alive like rats." His words embodied the campaign, not bold thrusts of steel, but survival under mud and fire. Everywhere, the enemy seemed to be there and not there. Minefields replaced battle lines. Booby traps claimed more lives than bullets. Empty villages unnerved men who expected machine guns behind every shutter. The Germans fought not to hold ground, but to delay, to sap confidence, to force France into second-guessing itself. And the memories gnawed. Veterans muttered that nothing had changed, that generals still issued orders to be cautious, that artillery still dictated every move, that soldiers still paid the price in mud and fear. Younger men, who had grown up on their fathers' stories of Verdun, now lived those tales for themselves. "We are fighting ghosts as much as Germans," one diary recorded. Still, pride flickered amid the gloom. Some soldiers scrawled "Ici les Français" on walls, leaving proof of their presence. Others collected scraps of German signs or badges, reminders that they had set foot in the enemy's land. These small gestures carried meaning. France had not been idle, however faint the results. But the weight of restraint pressed harder each day. Each casualty felt needless. Each halt in the advance a reminder that their leaders were governed by a command shackled by the ghosts of the past. For many, the Saar Offensive seemed less like a strike for Poland than a ritual, an echo of old wars repeated without conviction. Even as French soldiers crouched in mud on German soil, their government bound them with chains of restraint. Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, still haunted by the mass graves of 1914-18, feared escalation more than he desired victory. For him, every bold move seemed less a path to triumph than a prelude to catastrophe. The debate burned hottest in the skies. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, urged the Allies to strike German industry at once, to cripple the factories that powered Hitler's war machine. French aircraft could have rained destruction on the Saar's coal mines and steel plants. Yet Daladier vetoed the plan. He trembled at the thought of the Luftwaffe retaliating against Paris, reducing the City of Light to rubble. The memory of Guernica, burned into Europe's imagination, still chilled French nerves. Churchill proposed another scheme, Operation Royal Marine. Mines would be floated down the Rhine to cripple shipping and infrastructure. Again, Daladier intervened, convinced that Germany would repay France by mining the Seine. Better, he argued, to avoid provocation than to risk retaliation. And so the French Air Force, instead of bombs, dropped millions of leaflets, pamphlets fluttering down on German towns urging civilians to resist Hitler. To soldiers shivering at the front, it was insulting. They risked their lives while their leaders waged war with paper. Requests from the generals for deeper thrusts into Germany met the same fate. Reports poured in that resistance was weak, that German defenses were brittle, that the path to the Rhine lay open. Yet in Paris, each proposal was filtered through layers of fear. What if it was a trap? What if Germany struck back harder than expected? What if France lost too much too soon? The result was not bold strategy, but strategic inertia, a refusal to gamble even when the odds were favorable. Thus, the Saar Offensive became what Daladier and Gamelin truly intended, a gesture, not a war-winning blow. It was enough to tell Britain and Poland that France had acted, but not enough to risk the kind of decisive confrontation that might change the course of history. For the men in the field, it was worse than doing nothing. It was courage wasted, smothered by a government afraid of its own shadow. On the map spread across Allied headquarters, France held the winning hand. By mid-September, the French army had massed some 85 divisions along the frontier. Opposite them, Germany fielded just 34 divisions, many little more than reservists, old men and untrained youths with rifles, buying time while Hitler's main strength devoured Poland. The Wehrmacht's panzers and motorized units, the pride of Blitzkrieg, were hundreds of miles away in the east. For any strategist, it was a golden moment. France held superiority in manpower, artillery, and armor. Its tanks, though scattered, outclassed what few German machines guarded the west. Its lines of supply and mobilization were intact. The Rhineland, with its industries and mines, lay vulnerable. Even German officers would later admit that the Reich had stood exposed, a colossus with clay feet in those first weeks of war. And yet, the French advance remained halting, deliberate, shackled. Each request to push deeper met the same answer from Paris: go slow, hold back, minimize risk. Mines were cleared, woods patrolled, villages occupied, then progress stalled. What should have been a thunderous march became a cautious crawl. The soldiers themselves saw the imbalance. Some wrote home in disbelief that so little resistance barred their path. "We expected fire," one private confessed, but found silence. "The land itself fights us more than the Germans." Another, watching tanks idle behind the lines, wondered why their strength was being wasted. What unfolded was not the defeat of French arms, but the triumph of a paralysis of will. France had the means, the men, the machines. What it lacked was the will to strike boldly. Every day spent in caution gave Germany time. Time to finish Poland, time to recall divisions, time to prepare for the real storm that would come in 1940. For a brief, fleeting moment, the Allies held the knife at Hitler's throat. But instead of plunging it in, they loosened their grip. The advantage slipped away, not lost to German brilliance, but to French restraint. On September 12, 1939, with French troops holding ground inside Germany and the path ahead seemingly open, General Maurice Gamelin issued a fateful command: halt all offensive operations. What had begun with the promise of a strike into Hitler's Reich was reduced to stillness. Instead of pressing forward, the French army was ordered to dig in and prepare to withdraw. Gamelin justified the order with warnings of a German counterattack through Belgium, the very route that had brought catastrophe in 1914. To him, the risk of being outflanked outweighed the gains already won. Better, he argued, to preserve France's army intact than to gamble it on what might prove a trap. But for officers in the field, the order was incomprehensible. Reports from the front spoke of thin defenses, weak opposition, and opportunities waiting to be seized. Charles de Gaulle, then a colonel, dismissed the entire effort as a few demonstrations. André Beaufret, who would later become one of France's leading strategists, condemned it as nothing more than a gesture. Among the troops, bitterness spread. They had crossed minefields, endured mortars, occupied German villages, only to be told to sit idle. One soldier wrote, "We marched into Germany as victors and left it like children scolded for playing too far from home. The effect on morale was corrosive. Men who had believed they were fighting for Poland now realized they had been used for appearances. Their courage had been squandered by an abundance of caution that bordered on inaction. Letters home turned somber. Hope gave way to cynicism." Meanwhile, Poland collapsed. Warsaw had been under siege since September 8th, its defenders starved and bombarded daily. On September 17th, the Soviets invaded from the east, sealing the Republic's fate. At the very moment Poland cried out for relief, France pulled back the hand it had extended. The halt order revealed the heart of French strategy in 1939. The Saar Offensive was never intended to win a war. It was designed to show that France had done something, Once that gesture was made, Gamelin felt free to abandon it. What might have been a decisive blow became a hollow performance, undone not by German strength but by French fear. As French troops froze on the Saar front, Poland was being dismembered. In the first weeks of September, city after city fell to the Wehrmacht's advance. Krakow was seized on the 6th, and by the 8th German troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The capital, battered but defiant, prepared for a siege that would test the will of soldiers and civilians alike. The Luftwaffe showed no mercy. Waves of bombers pounded the city, turning entire neighborhoods into rubble. Fires consumed homes, churches, and hospitals. Civilians dug mass graves in parks. Families lived in cellars lit by candles, cooking meager meals on improvised stoves while artillery shook the ground above. Yet the people of Warsaw resisted. Barricades rose in the streets, manned by soldiers, policemen, and ordinary citizens armed with rifles, pistols, and bottles filled with gasoline. Then came the second blow. On September 17th, the Soviet Union marched in from the east, honoring its secret pact with Hitler. Red Army columns rolled across the frontier, swallowing towns already strained by the German assault. For Poland, it was the final catastrophe. Caught in a vice, crushed from both sides. Resistance no longer promised victory, only survival. The Polish High Command ordered the government to flee, hoping to preserve the state in exile. Leaders escaped through Romania, carrying the dream of a Poland that would fight on abroad. But for soldiers and civilians left behind, there was no such reprieve. They faced the grinding reality of conquest, imprisonment, and massacre. And still Warsaw fought. For nearly 3 weeks, its defenders held out against impossible odds. Children carried messages through the ruins, women filled sandbags, priests blessed fighters before they returned to the barricades. The city became a symbol of courage and suffering, even as hope bled away. Each day, Poles strained to hear that the French had advanced, that British bombers had struck the Reich. But the thunder that reached them was only German artillery. On September 28th, Warsaw fell. Exhausted, starved, reduced to ashes, the capital could endure no more. By October 6th, the last Polish units laid down their arms. A republic reborn only 2 decades earlier was erased once again, carved apart by its predators. For Poland, this was not just military defeat, it was betrayal. They had fought bravely, clinging to treaties that promised salvation, but salvation never came. France and Britain had declared war, yet their actions were smothered by strategic inertia. Poland was left to die alone, while its allies stood waiting on the wrong side of history. The Saar Offensive ended not with clash or collapse, but with a whisper. On September 17th, the same day the Red Army crossed into Poland, General Gamelin quietly ordered French forces to withdraw from German soil. What had been gained by sweat and sacrifice was now abandoned without contest. The retreat was carried out in darkness. Columns of soldiers slipped back over the frontier at night, their movements muffled, their presence concealed. To maintain the illusion of continued fighting, screening forces remained behind, firing occasional shells and sending out patrols to create noise in the silence. But behind them, division after division melted away. For the men, it was surreal. They had bled to clear minefields, endured mortar fire, and carved their names into German walls, only to be told to leave it all behind. Some scrawled bitter graffiti on buildings before departing. Les Français sont venus, puis repartis. The French came, then left. Others destroyed supplies they could not carry, as if to deny their enemy even the smallest prize. Most marched in silence, the pride of crossing into Germany replaced by the sting of futility. By mid-October, the retreat was complete. On the 17th, the last French units pulled out of the Saar. Within days, returning German troops reoccupied the abandoned villages, raising their flags where French soldiers had briefly stood. Every inch was recovered without resistance, as though the French had never been there at all. In Paris, the truth was hidden. Official communiques painted the withdrawal as a strategic repositioning, while newspapers filled their pages with empty optimism. The public was never told plainly that the offensive had been abandoned, but whispers spread, and veterans of 1914 shook their heads. This was not the France that had once bled itself dry to hold the Marne. This was a France that stepped forward, then shrank back. For Poland, the retreat was the final wound. Not only had the Allies failed to relieve them, they had also erased even the token effort made in their name. For Germany, it was vindication. Hitler's enemies lacked both speed and stomach. The decision was not born of betrayal, but of fear. Fear of losing too much, too soon. Yet in truth, it was a paralysis of will disguised as strategy. France had reached into Germany's chest, only to let go before it touched the heart. The silence of withdrawal was the sound of opportunity dying. History's cruelest wounds are those of missed opportunity, and September 1939 was one of them. In hindsight, even German commanders admitted how vulnerable the Reich had been in those weeks when France briefly stepped forward. General Alfred Jodl, later tried at Nuremberg, wrote with candor, "If we did not collapse in 1939, it was due to the fact that during the Polish campaign, the approximately 110 French and British divisions in the West were held completely inactive against the 23 German divisions. Those 23 were largely reservists, undertrained, under-equipped, old men and boys manning bunkers while the Reich's real strength fought in Poland." Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, went further. If France had pushed with determination, he confessed, it could have reached the Rhine without serious opposition and threatened the Ruhr, the industrial lifeblood of Hitler's war machine. They could have blazed from the border to the Rhine in 2 weeks, Halder later reflected, and there was nothing we could have done to stop them. Siegfried Westphal, Rommel's aide, echoed the same conclusion. France enjoyed absolute superiority in armor and maneuver. It had for a fleeting moment the kind of dominance generals dream of, and yet that advantage withered, not defeated in battle, but smothered by strategic inertia. The irony was brutal. Hitler had gambled everything on a lightning war in Poland, leaving his Western defenses threadbare. France had the knife at Germany's throat. One bold thrust could have changed history, perhaps even toppled the Nazi regime before it fully consolidated power. Instead, the Allies loosened their grip and stepped back. Historians still wrestle with the what-ifs. Could the Second World War have ended before it truly began? Could millions of lives have been spared if France had acted with audacity in September 1939? The answers lie forever in the realm of speculation. But the fact remains, the chance existed, clear and tangible. France and Britain chose not to take it. The Saar Offensive became not a story of defeat, but of opportunity squandered. A reminder that sometimes history turns not on battles fought, but on battles avoided. For the French soldiers who had crossed into Germany, the order to retreat felt like betrayal. They had braved minefields, mortar fire, and sleepless nights in mud-soaked trenches, only to be told their sacrifice was meaningless. What began with songs of confidence ended with silence, boots dragging in the muck, eyes lowered as they marched back across the frontier. Letters from the front seethed with frustration. One infantryman wrote, "We were ready to strike. The Germans were few." And then, nothing. Orders to return, as if our courage was a mistake. Another called the offensive a hollow spectacle. "We risked our lives for a show." Officers shared the same bitterness. Charles de Gaulle condemned the effort as a few demonstrations. André Beaufort judged it a gesture without conviction. This erosion of spirit was more dangerous than any German shell. Morale, once buoyant, began to sink. Soldiers who had believed in the justice of their cause now doubted their leader's willingness to fight. Around campfires and in barracks, whispers spread. France would never truly confront Germany. Its generals were too timid, its politicians too fearful. What had begun as duty curdled into cynicism. The effect rippled homeward. Families who had sent off their sons with pride now read newspapers that spoke vaguely of measured advances and strategic withdrawals. Rumors contradicted the official optimism. Veterans of 1914, who had endured 4 years of slaughter, watched in disbelief as their sons' courage was smothered not by enemy fire, but by their own command's reluctance. It was the cruelest irony. In 1914, France had bled itself nearly to death in reckless offensives. In 1939, it strangled its own momentum with a leadership shackled by the ghosts of the past. Courage at the bottom could not overcome caution at the top. The cracks in morale did not yet break the army, but they spread like hairline fractures across stone. France still had millions under arms, still possessed tanks and guns, still outwardly strong. But inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. Soldiers who had once believed they were marching to victory now wondered if they were marching toward futility. By late October 1939, the Saar Offensive was gone, and with it the last chance to relieve Poland. What remained on the Western Front was stillness. An uneasy silence history would brand the drôle de guerre, the strange war, or more damningly, the phony war. For French soldiers, the front became a place of monotony rather than menace. They dug shelters, strung barbed wire, repaired trenches, and patrolled into empty woods. The enemy was distant, unseen. The greatest foe was boredom. Letters home spoke of card games, carving wood, and endless speculation about when the real fighting would begin. One diary captured the mood in a single line. "We are armed, we are ready, but we do nothing." Civilians too adapted to the strange calm. Paris dimmed its boulevards under blackout orders, turning the city of light into shadow. Families stocked cellars, air raid sirens were tested, children practiced evacuation drills. Yet no bombs fell. Newspapers filled with rumors of imminent German attacks, but week after week passed in silence. Life became a waiting game, a holding of breath that never seemed to end. Culture itself bent under the strain of anticipation. Songs on the radio spoke of vigilance and endurance. Posters urged sacrifice and patience. In cafes, conversations circled endlessly around whispers that Germany was poised to strike through Belgium, that secret peace talks were underway, that the Allies were preparing a great offensive. None of it proved true. The stillness was deceptive. While France and Britain marked time, Hitler sharpened his sword. Divisions returned from Poland, rested, re-equipped, and planned. German factories worked day and night, pouring out weapons for the storm to come. The Reich used the months to prepare. France used them to wait. It was not peace. It was a slow corrosion of will, a strategic inertia disguised as waiting. The long pause lulled many into thinking the worst had passed. In truth, the worst had not yet begun. The Saar Offensive is remembered not for its victories, but for its revelations. On the surface, it was little more than a token advance. Villages briefly occupied, minefields cleared, then an orderly withdrawal. Compared to the cataclysms that followed, it seemed almost trivial. Yet in its brevity, it revealed the deeper weaknesses of France in 1939. General Maurice Gamelin embodied the mindset of his command. Careful, deliberate, unwilling to gamble. His every move was shaped by the memory of 1914-18, when reckless offensives had bled France white. In 1939, he chose the opposite extreme. The result was not safety, but an abundance of caution that bordered on inaction. For the soldiers, the lesson was bitter. They had marched into Germany with high spirits, believing they were fighting for Poland's survival, only to discover their sacrifices had been smothered by leaders who feared their own strength. Courage at the front could not overcome a leadership shackled by the ghosts of the past. For Poland, the Saar Offensive became the symbol of betrayal. They had been told France would strike, that relief was coming. Instead, they watched their nation destroyed while their allies sat idle. The memory scarred generations, a reminder that alliances on paper can prove hollow in practice. For Germany, the episode was a gift. Hitler had gambled that his Western enemies lacked resolve, and he was proved right. The Reich stood exposed in September 1939, yet France and Britain hesitated. From this, Hitler drew a lesson he would carry into 1940, that his enemies feared him more than he feared them. Historians still wrestle with the haunting counterfactuals. If France had pressed forward, if it had reached the Rhine, if it had struck at the Ruhr, could the Second World War have ended before it truly began? Could millions of lives have been spared? These are questions that history leaves unanswered, but not unasked. What is certain is that the Saar Offensive was more than a military footnote. It was the moment when the Allies held a fleeting advantage, when the Reich stood vulnerable, and when Europe might have been spared 6 years of devastation. Instead, the opportunity was lost, not to German strength, but to a paralysis of will. The Saar Offensive ended in silence. but its echoes shaped everything that followed. The fall of France, the suffering of Poland, and the terrible certainty that wars are not only lost in battlefields, they are lost in the choices leaders refuse to make.